They said Duke Lucien Ashcroft had once made a general weep by doing nothing, simply standing still in a doorway while the man confessed to cowardice. No raised voice, no drawn sword, just that stillness, that particular quality of attention he carried like a second skin, the kind that made every person in a room suddenly aware of exactly how much they stood to lose. 3 noble families had crumbled in the decades since he'd taken the duchy, not through warfare, through patience, through the precise, surgical application of consequences. The kingdom called him the Iron Duke, the silent ruin, the man whose enemies didn't fight back so much as gradually cease to exist. Today, every single one of those enemies had arranged for him to be married to a woman with nothing left to lose. What none of them understood, what Serafina Vale herself didn't yet understand, was that a man who had survived being hated by everyone had learned something the rest of the world hadn't. The most dangerous moment isn't when everything falls apart. It's the moment right before, when you still believe you have a choice. Stay for that moment. It changes everything. The morning Serafina Vale was scheduled to become a duchess, she woke before the servants arrived and spent 40 minutes at her window watching fog move through the lower city. She wasn't afraid. She'd already moved through fear and come out the other side into something colder and more useful. What she felt now was the particular clarity that comes when every exit has been walled off, and all that remains is the path directly forward, however brutal its destination. Her father's study had been sealed 3 weeks after his death. She'd watched from the top of the stairs while Lord Castellan Brennus and 2 men she didn't recognize carried out the ledgers, the correspondence, the iron strongbox her father used to lock with a key he wore around his neck while he slept. She'd been 19 then. She was 22 now, and in the intervening years the Vale estate had been administered by a rotating series of appointed trustees, every one of whom reported to the Council of Nobles that had declared her father's will, contested on grounds so procedurally obscure that Serafina's solicitor had spent 6 months simply learning what questions to ask before concluding, with profound apology in his eyes, that the legal architecture had been specifically designed to be unanswerable. The marriage contract had arrived 4 months ago. She remembered the weight of the document, physically heavy, sealed with 4 different wax impressions, and the specific quality of silence in the room after her guardian, Lady Evera Moswick, had read aloud the relevant clause. In accordance with the Council's decree regarding the administration of contested estates, the ward Serafina Ilara Vale, sole surviving heir of the late Lord Aldrich Vale, will enter into formal marriage with His Grace Lucian Damien Ashcroft, Duke of Cressmore, upon the date specified, said union to constitute full legal settlement of all outstanding claims against the Vale inheritance, said claims thereafter to be administered jointly by the Duke's estate. Lady Evara had set the document down with the particular care of someone placing something dangerous on a surface. Serafina had asked 3 questions. Where was the dagger her father had given her for her 18th birthday? Whether the clause included a provision for her own signature or simply her presence, and whether Lady Evara had known this was coming before the document arrived. The dagger was in a cedar box in her wardrobe. The provision required only her presence. Lady Evara had looked out the window for a long time before answering the 3rd question, and the length of that silence told Serafina everything she needed to know about who in her life she could trust and who she couldn't afford to. She'd spent the subsequent 4 months learning, not weeping, not petitioning, not appealing to people who had already made their calculations. Learning. She'd read every document she could access regarding Duke Lucien Ashcroft, every account of his conduct in the duchy, every rumor that had made its way into social correspondence, every transcript from the 2 council hearings he'd attended in the last 5 years. She'd spoken at length, under various pretexts, with 3 men who had served under him during the border campaign 7 years prior. She'd paid a significant portion of her remaining personal allowance to a woman who worked in the ducal household supply chain and had strong opinions about the Duke's character. What she'd assembled was a portrait with contradictions running through it like fault lines. The public account: ruthless administrator, cold personality, strategically brilliant, personally untouchable, responsible for the financial and political dissolution of at least 3 noble houses that had contested his authority. The campaign record: decisive, controlled, not given to battlefield rage, but utterly without hesitation when hesitation would cost lives. The household account: demanding standards, fair wages, staff turnover lower than average. The housekeeper who'd been with the ducal estate for 19 years had left one employer in her previous career, and it hadn't been Lucian Ashcroft. None of this constituted reassurance, but it complicated the simpler story, and Serafina had learned to distrust simple stories. The dagger was 4 inches of plain steel, functional rather than decorative, with a grip of dark horn and a balance her father had selected specifically for her hand. She'd practiced with it, quietly, in her room, in the months since the contract arrived. Not combat training. She had no illusions about her capacity to fight a man trained to warfare. Something else. The muscle memory of the weight, the knowledge that it was there, the particular kind of steadiness that comes from having made a decision before the moment arrives that requires it. She had made the decision. If the Duke was what the worst accounts described, if the ceremony concluded and the doors closed, and the man behind the fearsome reputation proved himself in private to be exactly the kind of creature who understood a woman's legal helplessness as an opportunity, she would not go quietly. She would not accept it as the price of survival. She understood, with the cold clarity that had replaced fear, that this decision might cost her everything. She'd made it anyway. The ivory gown was waiting on the dress form when the servants arrived. She let them work. She kept her face composed and answered their soft congratulations with the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes but didn't insult them either. She was practiced at that particular expression. She'd been deploying it for 3 years. When they finished, when the room was quiet again and she stood alone in front of the long mirror, she studied herself for a moment with something close to clinical detachment. The gown was genuinely beautiful. Someone had spent real money on the embroidery. Her dark hair had been arranged with more skill than she'd expected. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to look like, a bride. She reached into the cedar box she'd kept on the dressing table, beneath a stack of folded silk scarves, and took out the dagger in its plain leather sheath. She looked at it for a moment. Then she attached it to the ribbon garter beneath the gown's heavy skirt, in the place she'd been practicing for 3 months, and checked twice that the fabric concealed it at every angle. Then she picked up her gloves, walked to the door, and went downstairs to get married. The Cathedral of Cressmore was the oldest building in the city, its stone walls the particular gray of deep winter water, its spires high enough that in fog they disappeared entirely. It had been full since morning. Every noble family with a relationship to the council, every house that had business with the Duke's administration, every dignitary whose presence constituted a public statement about where their interests aligned. Serafina had been told the attendance was exceptional. She filed this information without assigning it sentiment. She arrived in a closed carriage. She walked the stone corridor from the side entrance to the main aisle. She was aware of the sound, hundreds of people creating that particular cathedral hush, the kind that is made entirely of suppressed noise. And she was aware of the light through the high windows, and she was aware distantly of the dagger's weight against her thigh, and she was aware of almost nothing else. She saw him before she reached the altar. He was standing with his back partially angled away, speaking in a low voice to the man beside him. His advocate, she recognized from the documents. Lucian Ashcroft was taller than she'd expected. The accounts had mentioned it, but the reality was different. He had the kind of height that arrived in a room before the rest of him did, the kind that required deliberate stillness to be manageable in enclosed spaces. Dark hair, close-cropped. He was wearing formal ducal attire, dark coat, the Cressmore crest at his collar, and wearing it the way men wear clothes they've put on 10,000 times without thinking about them. He turned when the processional sound changed. His eyes found her immediately, and she understood in that moment why 3 noble families had crumbled without a fight. It wasn't the coldness of his gaze, though it was cold. It was the completeness of his attention, the sense that he had assessed everything relevant and was no longer in the process of deciding what anything meant. There was no social performance in it, no welcoming warmth, no reassuring public kindness for the audience's benefit. He simply looked at her with the focused directness of a man who found pretense expensive and had stopped paying for it some years ago. She held his gaze and walked to the altar. She would not be the one to look away first. She understood this, in the same cold clarity, as a decision that mattered. He didn't look away either, not once, through the walk down the aisle. The ceremony was formal, abbreviated in the places that could be abbreviated, conducted by the officiant with the brisk competence of a professional. Serafina answered when she was required to answer. She was aware of Lucien's voice, low, measured, the voice of a man who spoke rarely enough that people listened when he did. She was aware of his hand when it was required, the formal clasp, brief and correct, no pressure beyond what protocol demanded. She was aware, in particular, of the moment the rings were exchanged. She looked at the plain platinum band on her finger for exactly 2 seconds before returning her attention to the necessary formalities. She didn't look at her face in the moment. She had learned not to monitor her own expressions when the monitoring would compromise them. It was done in under an hour. The guests applauded in the formal way of people applauding something significant they hadn't personally chosen. Lord Castellan-Brennus, in the front row, was smiling the satisfied smile of a man watching a transaction conclude. Serafina had thought, in the months of preparation, that she would feel something specific at this moment. Rage or grief or the particular claustrophobia of a cage door closing. What she felt instead was strangely neutral. She had prepared for every contingency. The next phase required information she didn't yet have. She walked out of the cathedral on the arm of the Duke of Crestmore. Cool. The public reception was a thing to be endured, and she endured it. 2 hours of formal movement through a hall full of people who watched her with the layered attention of those assessing a new piece on the board. Some of them greeted her warmly. She understood that warmth's specific weight and filed it accordingly. Some of them were measuring her with less concealment than they perhaps realized, and she let them measure, keeping her expression pleasant and saying very little that contained content. Lucien, for his part, was remarkable, not in the way she'd expected. She'd anticipated a performance, some public version of the gracious host, the powerful man willing to display magnanimity on his wedding day. What she got instead was someone who was simply present and precise and thoroughly uninterested in performing anything. He spoke to the guests who required speaking to. He didn't hover. He didn't touch her beyond what the occasion formally demanded. When she caught him watching her twice across the room, his expression was the same each time. That particular focused neutrality, the face of a man cataloging rather than evaluating. She found it more unsettling than cruelty would have been. Cruelty she had prepared for. This she didn't yet have a category for. The carriages arrived at the ducal estate, Ashcroft House, inside the city's upper quarter. As late afternoon settled into early evening, the house was enormous, 4 stories of old stone, a formal courtyard, the housekeeper waiting at the door with 2 senior staff members. Everything was managed with the quiet efficiency of a household that had been running well for a long time and knew it. Serafina was shown to her rooms. They were on the 2nd floor, in the east wing. They were large, well-furnished, with a sitting room and a bathing room and a bedroom that looked out over the formal garden. Someone had put fresh flowers on the dresser. Not roses, she noted, but wildflowers, which was either a remarkable coincidence or someone's deliberate thought. She didn't yet know enough to determine which. She sat in the chair by the window for a few minutes after the maid left, still in the wedding gown, and did what she always did when she entered a new space. She mapped it. The exits, the sight lines, the distance to the door, the window and whether it opened fully and what was below it. Then she went over the evening's events systematically, the way her father had taught her to examine a business situation. What she'd observed, what it meant, what she didn't know, and what the next necessary question was. What she'd observed. A man who made no public performance of kindness, a household that operated without visible strain, 2 guests at the reception who had watched her specifically in the manner of people looking for a weakness rather than a social impression, and the fact that Lucien Ashcroft had not drunk anything alcoholic during the entire reception, which was either asceticism or deliberate maintenance of clarity, and either interpretation was worth noting. What she didn't know, everything essential. A knock at the sitting room door. She crossed from the bedroom and opened it. He was standing in the corridor. Without the formal context of the ceremony or the observation of the reception, he was simply a man in a doorway, and the plainness of the moment was somehow starker than everything preceding it. He had changed out of the formal attire into something simpler. Dark trousers, a shirt without its collar, the sleeves pushed back. He was holding a glass of water. Not wine. Water. "I'm not going to offer an apology," he said without preamble, without softening. "An apology for what's been done to you would be dishonest, because I can't undo it, and I'm not interested in dishonest gestures. But I thought you should hear directly from me tonight what the arrangement actually is." Serafina held the door frame and said nothing. She waited. "You have full use of the house," he said. "Your rooms are your own. I won't enter them without being invited. You'll have access to the estate accounts relevant to your family's holdings, which I'll have transferred to a separate ledger within the week so you can review them independently. You're not required to appear at social functions unless you choose to. You're not required to function as a decorative presence at my meetings or my dinners." He paused. "One beat. If you're carrying a weapon, keep it. I won't force anything from you." The silence after this was the loudest thing she'd heard all day. She looked at him for a long moment. His face gave her nothing she hadn't already observed. The same focused neutrality, the same absence of performance. He wasn't waiting for gratitude. He wasn't waiting for warmth. He appeared to be waiting for information. "Why are you telling me this tonight?" she said. "Because tomorrow you'll start watching everything I do to determine if it aligns with what I've said. I'd rather not waste your first week here on that." He paused again. "I've read your father's correspondence with the council. I know what the last 3 years looked like. I wanted to give you accurate parameters so you could make real decisions instead of guessing at mine." Something in her chest did a thing she hadn't anticipated. She controlled her expression before it could register. "And what do you get from this arrangement?" she asked. "Direct, flat, without apology for the directness." "Something they didn't want me to have," he said. "They put this together to manage me, to give the council a hold on my interests through yours. If you and I are not what they designed this to create, that plan fails." He looked at her with the same complete attention as the cathedral. "I don't particularly enjoy their plans succeeding." She didn't respond immediately. She was thinking, and she let herself think without filling the silence, because she'd learned early that the instinct to fill silence was something people used against you. "I'll need the name of every person who served as trustee of the Vale estate," she said finally. Something shifted in his face. "Barely. Enough." "I'll have it delivered to you in the morning," he said. He left. No extended farewell, no soft conclusion to make the moment feel warmer than it was. He simply walked back down the corridor, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs, measured and even. She closed the door. She stood in the center of the sitting room for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she sat down at the writing desk, took out a sheet of paper, and began making notes. The first week was, as he had suggested, a matter of calibration. She watched, she cataloged, she developed, methodically and without sentiment, a working map of the household's structure and the Duke's daily patterns. He rose early. She established this by the sounds of the house before 6, the way the corridors moved differently once he was in them. He worked in the study on the ground floor for 3 hours before receiving anyone. The study door remained open during this time, which she found notable. She'd expected a closed-door management style. The open door meant he wanted to hear the household moving, wanted that ambient information, that continual low-level contact with the reality of his environment. He ate simply. The kitchen staff, with whom she spent a deliberate amount of time on the pretext of learning the household's preferences, told her without much prompting that the Duke had no particular requirements, except that nothing be wasted and that the staff ate before the formal meals were served. This last detail she turned over several times, because it was the kind of thing people said to seem generous, and the kind of thing you could verify by actually checking the kitchen's schedule, which she did, and it was true. She met the housekeeper, Mira Thane, on the 3rd day. Mira was 50-something, economical in movement and expression, with the look of someone who had spent 2 decades being professionally reliable and had no particular desire to be charming about it. "He told me you'd want to understand how things work here," Mira said, without introduction, when Serafina came to find her in the linen room. Serafina looked at her. "He told you that?" "Yesterday morning. He said to answer your questions directly and not to frame things to make him look good." Mira said this without particular expression. "I thought you might want to know that he said it." "Thank you," Serafina said. She spent an hour with Mira. She learned that the Duke had inherited a household in significant dysfunction from his father 8 years prior, that the staff reorganization had taken 18 months and no one had been dismissed without documented cause, that the formal entertaining had decreased substantially in the last 3 years. He doesn't like it. He does it when it's necessary, and not when it isn't, and that in 19 years Mira Thane had seen one member of the Duke's household staff be dismissed for cause, and that cause had been the theft of correspondence that was subsequently sold to a council-aligned house, and that Lucian Ashcroft had delivered the dismissal himself, in the study, with the door closed. "What happened to the person?" Serafina asked. "They found other employment," Mira said. "I don't know where. He didn't pursue it further." She paused. "He could have. He had grounds for considerably more than dismissal. He didn't pursue it." Serafina filed this. On the fourth day, she received the list of trustees. 6 names. 3 she recognized immediately from council records she'd already reviewed. 2 were from houses that had expanded their holdings significantly in the years since her father's death, which was circumstantial but worth noting. The 6th name she didn't recognize, and she spent most of that afternoon establishing who it was. A man named Aldrich Fane, junior legal advocate, whose practice had received substantial contracts from 2 of the 5 other trustees in the year following her father's death. She wrote this down. She wrote everything down. She was in the library. The Ducal Estates library was significant. 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling shelving, a reading table she had claimed by the simple expedient of working there every afternoon until it became established. When Lucian came in on the 5th evening, 7 days after the wedding, he stopped when he saw her. She was sitting at the table with 3 ledgers open and her notes spread across the left half of the surface, and she'd had the lamp lit because the light was failing. "I can find somewhere else," she said, because the information she'd gathered suggested he used this room regularly, and she was technically in what might be a habitual space. "No," he said. He crossed to the other reading table, on the south wall, and took a book from the shelf without deliberating over the choice. He sat down with the complete ease of a man in a room he knows well and opened the book. He didn't look at what she was working on. He didn't ask. She looked at him for a moment. Then she returned to the ledger. They sat in silence for 2 hours. It was, she realized at some point in the middle of it, the least tense 2 hours she'd spent in 3 years. She resented this, slightly. It would have been simpler if he'd been consistently monstrous. The first threat arrived on the 10th day. It was not elaborate. A folded note, delivered with the household correspondence, without a seal. Inside, in handwriting that had been deliberately altered, she recognized the alterations. She'd read enough falsified documents in the legal proceedings around her father's estate. 4 words. "Leave before they finish." She read it twice. She turned it over. She looked at the way it had been inserted into the correspondence bundle. Not on top, not on the bottom, in the middle, which meant either it had come through the same channel as the rest and been placed there by whoever sorted the mail, or someone inside the household had added it. She didn't go to Lucian. Not yet. She didn't have enough information to make that conversation useful, and more importantly, she didn't yet know enough about his response to threats to predict what he'd do with it. She went instead to Mira Thane and, with the pretext of wanting to understand household systems, spent 40 minutes learning how the morning correspondence was processed from arrival to the point where it reached the sorting table. There were 3 people who had contact with it during that window. A porter named Jest, a junior secretary named Wren, who was 19 and had been with the household 8 months, and the senior secretary, a man named Dalton Core, who had held the position for 6 years. She returned to the library. She put the note in the back of the ledger she was using for the trustee research. She thought about the 2 guests at the reception who had watched her with the assessment of people looking for weakness. She thought about Lord Castellan Brennis's satisfied smile as the ceremony concluded. She thought about the fact that the conspiracy her father had fallen prey to had not, based on everything she'd been able to establish, ended with his death. He had known something. She had fragments of evidence that pointed toward it, not proof, not yet. And he had died before he could act on it. She thought about the phrase "before they finish," not before they decide, not before they act, before they finish. Present tense, ongoing. She wrote a new heading in her notes. Timeline, active operation. She was writing under it when she heard footsteps in the corridor that she recognized by now as Lucian's. She didn't cover the notes. She kept writing. He came to the doorway. He looked at her without entering. "You've been in here since 6 this morning," he said. "I'm aware of the time," she said. A pause. "Core was asking about you," he said. The senior secretary. He came to me this morning with questions about your role in the household, specifically whether you'd be reviewing correspondence. Serafina looked up. What did you tell him? She said. That I hadn't decided yet. He was watching her with that complete attention. Which was true at the time. I'm deciding now. The question is whether there's a reason you'd want that information or whether I should be asking you a different question. This was the moment. She understood it as such, immediately and without ambiguity. She could deploy the note as a tool, as evidence, as a way of establishing her position in whatever was happening in this household, or she could keep it and work alone. She'd spent 3 years working alone. She was good at it. She was also, she had to acknowledge, limited by it. She reached into the ledger and took out the note and set it on the table facing him. He crossed the room. He looked at the note without touching it. His face didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of his stillness. A tightening, controlled instantly, but there. When did this arrive? He said. This morning, in the correspondence bundle. And you didn't bring it to me immediately. No, she said. I went and learned how the correspondence is processed first. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her. And what did you conclude? 3 possible points of insertion. I haven't determined which one yet. I have a preference for Dalton Core based on the timing of his questions to you, but I don't have evidence. Preference isn't evidence. Another pause. No, he said. It isn't. He picked up the note, examined it briefly, set it back down. You've done this before. The investigative methodology. My father ran a significant trading estate, she said. I was involved in its administration from the time I was 16. He thought it was important that I understand how operations could be compromised. He was right, Lucian said. Flat, direct, no performance of warmth around it. Something she wasn't going to name moved through her and was gone. I want access to the correspondence records going back 6 months, she said. You'll have them tomorrow morning. And I want to know whether there have been other threats, to you, in the last year. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. She counted. 5, he said, varying in specificity. You didn't report them to the council. No, because reporting them would have told the council you were aware of the operation before they wanted you to be. His expression shifted, barely, enough. You're going to be a significant complication, he said. There was no hostility in it. She thought, with the part of her mind that was always processing, that it might be the first thing he'd said to her that contained something other than flat information delivery. She wasn't going to assign it weight until she understood it better. I've been told that before, she said. She turned back to the ledger. After a moment, she heard him pull out the chair across the table and sit down. Show me what you have, he said. She turned the ledger around. They worked for 3 hours, side by side across the reading table, the lamp burning down, the house settling into its nighttime quiet around them. She had expected, if this moment came, to feel something adversarial about it. Seated across from the man who had, however indirectly, benefited from the legal machinery that had stripped 3 years from her life. She had prepared, in the months before the marriage, for the possibility of having to cooperate with him tactically, while maintaining a fundamental distrust of his motives. What she hadn't prepared for was the quality of his mind. He read quickly, without comment, and when he commented it was precise and without ornamentation. He identified 2 connections in the trustee records she hadn't yet made, one involving a land transfer that her notes didn't flag because she hadn't yet cross-referenced that particular set of dates. He laid out the implication without dwelling on it, moved to the next page. You already knew some of this, she said, at some point after midnight. He looked up. Some of it, he said. The trustees. 2 of the names, not the Fane connection. She looked at him. Why didn't you move on it? His jaw tightened. Fractional. Because acting on incomplete information against coordinated opposition gives them the initiative. They get to define the scope of the conflict. I've been waiting for a complete picture. You've been waiting, she said, while they administered my father's estate. His eyes stayed on hers. Yes, he said. I'm telling you that directly, so you have accurate information. She sat with this for a moment. It was a specific kind of painful, the kind that comes from honesty you didn't want. She'd asked for it. She didn't regret asking. The complete picture, she said. How close were you? Before this evening. A pause. Not close. She looked down at the ledger spread between them, the months of work on her side of the table, the connection she'd built from a position of legal helplessness and personal determination. We're closer now, she said. Considerably, he said. They went back to the work. At some point, she became aware that the note she'd received that morning, leave before they finish, had shifted in its meaning. Not a warning, a miscalculation. Whoever had sent it had assessed her as someone who would be frightened off, who would take the path of compliance and disappear into the prescribed role of decorative duchess. They had assessed wrong. She was still thinking this when a sound from the corridor broke the late-night quiet of the house. Not large. A door. Footsteps that stopped. Both of them lifted their heads at the same moment. Lucien's hand moved, not dramatically, not with the performance of alarm, simply with the reflex of someone who had trained it in a particular direction. And she saw, with perfect clarity, the outline of the blade at his side that she hadn't known was there. A knock at the library door, the porter jest, white-faced in the lamplight, holding a folded note with shaking hands. I was told to deliver this immediately, Your Grace. I was told you'd want to see it tonight. He looked at Seraphina and then away. I was told specifically, if the Duchess is present, give it to her. Lucien looked at Seraphina. She crossed the room and took the note from Jest. She opened it. Inside, in clear, unaltered handwriting, she recognized from the council correspondence she'd reviewed over months. 6 names. 3 she knew, 3 she didn't. Below the names, 2 lines. These 6 met this evening. They've changed their timeline. You have until the midwinter gala to cooperate or they move forward. What they move forward with will destroy you both. The choice is yours, Duchess. Not his. Yours. The silence in the library was the silence of a room that has just become a different kind of room. She turned and showed it to Lucien. She watched his face read it. She watched the thing that happened in his jaw and his eyes, and the particular quality of stillness that preceded whatever came next for a man like this. The midwinter gala, she said. That's 19 days, he said. She looked at the 3 names she didn't recognize. I don't know the bottom 3. I do, he said. His voice was very quiet. The 3rd one. He looked at her. Is my chief advisor, Caelan Morrow. He's been with me for 7 years. The lamp flickered. Outside, somewhere distant, she heard the city sound that cities make at night, the specific murmur of a world that doesn't know it's about to be different. She thought about the trust her father had placed in people and what it had cost him. She thought about what 19 days meant against a coordinated conspiracy with legal, financial, and apparently intimate access to the Duke's inner operations. She thought about the choice the note had offered her. Yours, not his, and exactly what that choice was designed to accomplish, and why the offer had been made. She put the note down on the table. Tell me about Caelan Morrow, she said. Everything. Starting from the beginning. Lucien looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that she still didn't have a name for. That's going to take a while, he said. Then we'd better start now, she said. Outside the window, the city moved through its late-night hours, indifferent and enormous, carrying somewhere within it the 6 people who had decided their timeline, and the man who had walked beside Lucien Ashcroft for 7 years while working against him, and the 19 days remaining between where they were and whatever came next. Seraphina Vale, Duchess of Cressmore, sat back down at the table across from her husband, the dagger still strapped beneath the gown she was still wearing, and opened a clean page in her ledger. She was no longer working alone, and neither was he. Caelan Morrow had been 7 years in the building. That was the first thing Lucien said, and he said it to the lamp rather than to her, which told Seraphina something about the specific texture of this particular wound. Not the broad, strategic wound of betrayal. She could see him handling that, the machinery of his mind already calculating angles and contingencies, but the smaller, uglier thing underneath it, the kind that doesn't have a clean name. 7 years, she said. He came to me after the border campaign. He'd served as a logistics coordinator under General Ashby. I knew his work before I knew him. Lucien's hands were flat on the table, very still. He was the one who told me about the first threat. 8 months after I took the duchy. Someone had been moving against the estate's grain contracts, quietly, through 3 intermediary brokers. Kaylin found it, brought it to me with the full documentation, which established your trust in him immediately. Yes, Serafina looked at the name on the note. And it's possible he found it because he planted it. The silence that followed was the kind that confirms rather than denies. I've been thinking that for approximately 4 minutes, Lucian said. She pulled the ledger toward her and wrote Morrow's name at the top of a fresh page. Tell me his access. Everything he can see, touch, authorize, or redirect without your direct knowledge, he told her. It took 20 minutes, and by the end of it, she had a column of entries that added up to something close to architectural. Morrow didn't just have access to the Duke's operations, he had been positioned year by year at every structural joint where information became action. Correspondence review, staff hiring approval, the Duke's social calendar, the routing of sensitive documents between Ashcroft House and the council offices. He helped design the filing system, Lucian said. Of course he did, Serafina said. She wrote that down too. Lucian stood and went to the window. He stood there with his back to her for a moment, not dramatically, not with the performance of a man processing emotion, but with the practical quality of someone who needed to look at something that wasn't the problem for 30 seconds in order to return to the problem more clearly. The note said the choice is yours, he said, not mine. Yes. They think you're the leverage point. They think I'm the one with something left to lose, she said. They've already decided you won't capitulate, so they're offering me a separate exit. Cooperate and they leave me alone. Leave the estate, possibly. Publicly confirm whatever version of events they need confirmed, in exchange for what remains of my father's holdings, presumably, and my continued freedom of movement. He turned from the window. And you find that offer insulting, she said. They've been managing the Vale estate for 3 years. Whatever's left of it after that administration is a fraction of what it was. They're offering me the remnants of something they already stripped. She met his eyes. But more than that, they think I can be separated from this, from whatever you and I are now in this room with this information between us. She looked at the ledger. They miscalculated the night they sent the first note. They miscalculated further tonight. He was looking at her with that particular quality of attention that she had mostly stopped finding unsettling and had started simply treating as a fact of being in his vicinity. What do you need from me? He said. Tomorrow, she said. Morrow's schedule for the last 6 months. Every meeting he attended in my absence that wasn't on the formal record. And I need to understand the midwinter gala. Who hosts it, who controls the guest list, what the formal proceedings are, and where the pressure points are in that specific setting. I can have all of it by morning. Then go to sleep, she said. You're not useful to me exhausted. Something moved across his face. Barely. She'd started to recognize it as the expression he made when she said something he hadn't expected and couldn't immediately categorize. He left without further ceremony. She stayed another hour, alone in the library, and worked. Wisha. She slept 4 hours and woke clear-headed. The materials were outside her sitting room door when she opened it at 5:30, a leather portfolio with Morrow's schedule notations, and a second document that turned out to be Lucian's own handwritten summary of the gala's structure. 3 pages in a compressed, precise script that communicated a great deal about how his mind organized information. She took both back to the desk and worked through them with her tea going cold beside her. The gala was hosted annually by House Renwick, Lord Castor Renwick, one of the 6 names on the note. She'd recognized his name immediately. Now she stared at it for a long moment. The host of the event where the conspiracy planned to move was one of the conspirators. The venue was controlled. The guest list was controlled. 19 days. She turned to Morrow's schedule. The pattern was there once she knew to look for it. Not obvious, whoever had constructed this had constructed it carefully, but present. 8 meetings in the last 6 months that appeared in Morrow's personal notation, but not in the formal calendar. 3 of them occurred on dates that corresponded, within a day or two, with escalations in the legal proceedings against the Vale estate that she'd documented in her own research. The timeline fit, not proof, consistent. She added a new line to her notes. Morrow as coordination point between council operation and Vale estate administration. Then she sat back and looked at what she had. What she had was enough to understand the shape of the conspiracy. What she didn't have was evidence sufficient to expose it publicly, legally, in a setting that would prevent the 6 names on that note from simply reframing the situation and absorbing the damage. She had enough to know she was right. She needed enough to make being right matter. 19 days. She dressed and went downstairs. She found Morrow in the east corridor at 7:15, moving toward the study with a leather satchel and the brisk efficiency of a man with a full schedule. She'd timed it. She'd been watching the household's morning movements for a week, and she knew that this corridor at this hour was where Morrow transitioned between the staff wing and the working areas of the house, and she knew it was usually empty. She let him see her from 20 feet away and kept walking toward him. She watched his face perform the shift that faces perform when they're maintaining a position, the fractional recalibration, the professional warmth arriving a beat too precisely. "Your Grace," he said. "Good morning. I hope you're settling in well." She stopped at a comfortable conversational distance, not close enough to be aggressive, close enough that he'd have to make a decision about how to end the conversation. "I've been reviewing the estate administration records," she said. "The Vale holdings." "Of course. His Grace mentioned you'd be—" "The Fane account," she said. "Aldrich Fine, the junior advocate. His practice received contracts from 3 of the 6 trustees in the year following my father's death. I was wondering if you had any familiarity with his work." She watched him. Not his face. Faces were trained, especially faces that had been performing for 7 years. She watched his hands and his chest and the particular quality of the breath that came out of him in the half-second before he answered. That half-second was everything. "I don't believe I do," he said, "though I'm not deeply familiar with the legal networks around the Vale administration. That would have been handled before my involvement with the estate matters." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "Thank you." She walked past him. She didn't look back. She counted his footsteps behind her as they resumed and noted that they were 3 beats slower than his approach pace had been, and that they stopped once, briefly, before continuing. She went to the library and wrote, "Morrow knows Fane. Reaction to name, recognition suppressed, not genuine absence of knowledge. Breathing change consistent with stress response, not irritation." She underlined knows Faney twice, on Tasha. Lucien found her there an hour later. He came in without knocking. The door was open, and stopped 2 feet inside. "Morrow came to see me," he said. She looked up. "When?" 20 minutes ago. He told me you'd asked him about the Vale legal administration. He framed it as wanting to make sure I was aware of your research focus." He paused. He did it very naturally. If I hadn't spent last night looking at his name on that note, I would have taken it as ordinary staff communication. "He's testing whether you told me about him," she said. "Yes." "And what did you tell him?" "That I was aware of your research and that you had full access to relevant records." He came fully into the room and sat down across from her. "He doesn't know I've seen the note." "Good. Keep it that way." She turned the ledger to show him the Fane notation. "He knows fine, I'm certain of it. Not certain enough to stake anything on it publicly, but I'm not operating in the dark anymore." He looked at the notation. He looked at her. "You went to him directly." "I needed to know what he'd do with a pressure point. Now I know. He moves immediately to you. He needs to control your information environment, which means he's worried about you developing independent sources." She met his eyes. "Which means the plan requires your isolation, not just your compliance. They need you making decisions without full context." "Which I've been doing," he said. "Flat. Without self-indulgence in it." "Which most people would do with someone in that position for 7 years," she said. "It's not a failure of intelligence. It's how the operation was designed." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him doing what she'd come to recognize as his version of recalibration, the settling of something that had been destabilized back into a position from which it could function. "The gala," he said. "Renwick hosts it." "I know. I saw the notes." "If we don't attend, it's read as weakness. If we attend, we're on his ground with 19 days of preparation behind them and whatever they've built into the event structure." "We don't attend to survive the evening," she said. "We attend to expose them in it. The gala is the venue they chose because they control it. If we can turn that control into their vulnerability instead of ours. She stopped, looked at the notes. I need the guest list, every confirmed attendee, and I need to know what Renwick's financial position actually is, independent of what he presents to the council. Renwick's finances are... Lucian paused. There are irregularities. I've known about them for 2 years. I didn't have a mechanism to surface them that wouldn't be absorbed by the council majority. She looked at him. Show me what you have. It's in the study. Come on, accept. The study was the room she'd been most curious about and had, until now, entered only once, briefly, when Lucian had shown her the household's emergency protocols on her second day. It was not what the duchy's fearsome reputation might have suggested, not sparse or punishing or performatively austere. It was a working room, which meant it was dense with material. Documents in organized stacks, 2 large maps on the wall with notation in red ink, a desk that was clearly used for hours every day, a reading chair that had the particular compression of furniture that carries weight regularly. He went to the locked cabinet beneath the east window and came back with a file. He set it on the desk between them and stepped back. She opened it. The Renwick financial material was 3 years of accumulated careful documentation, ledgers, correspondence copies, a set of property transfer records that had been, she could see immediately, structured to obscure the direction of capital movement. She'd seen similar structures in the Vale estate mismanagement, slightly different mechanism, same underlying logic. Who compiled this? She said. I did, he said. Over time, when I had the material. She looked up from the file. He was standing with his arms crossed, not defensively. Practically, the posture of a man containing something. You built a case against Renwick, she said. For 2 years. Alone. Yes. Because you didn't have anyone you could trust with it. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She looked back at the file and felt something she was going to continue not naming move through her chest and settle into something functional. They had been doing the same thing, from opposite ends of the same trap, building cases in isolation, accumulating evidence they couldn't use, waiting for a complete picture that kept being incomplete because the people who should have been their resources were the people they needed to build the case against. 19 days, she said. 19 days, he said. She took the Renwick file and the ledger with her Vale notes and put them side by side on the desk. Then we have work to do, she said. The next 12 days had a particular quality that she would later, looking back, recognize as the specific texture of shared purpose under pressure. Not comfortable. Comfort wasn't the frame. Functional. Intensely, sometimes exhaustingly functional. They worked in the study. They worked in the library. They developed, without formally discussing it, a practice of dividing the research along the lines of their respective knowledge and reconvening every evening to integrate what each of them had found. He was faster with the financial documentation. She was better with the correspondence analysis, with reading the subtext of what people wrote to each other when they believed they were being careful. They argued 3 times in the first week, genuinely argued, not performed disagreement, the kind that involved raised voices and the particular sharpness of 2 people who were both accustomed to being right. Each argument produced something better than either position they'd started from. She noted this without assigning it the weight it might have carried under other circumstances. Morrow continued his ordinary function in the household. He was good at it. She had to acknowledge the quality of the performance, because dismissing competent opposition was a form of carelessness she couldn't afford. He managed Lucien's schedule with smooth efficiency. He was unfailingly pleasant to her in the manner of someone who had decided she was a complication to be managed rather than a threat to be neutralized. She let him believe that assessment was accurate. On the 14th day, she found something. She'd been working through the correspondence records from the year before her father's death. She'd had them transferred to Ashcroft House on the pretext of legal review, and no one had questioned it because the request was entirely consistent with her established research pattern. She'd been through most of them twice. On the 3rd pass, in a letter from her father to his solicitor dated 8 months before his death, she found a name she'd seen before. Aldrich Fane, the same junior advocate whose practice had received counsel-connected contracts after her father died. Her father had written to his solicitor about a meeting with Fane, a meeting that, Based on the letter's context, her father had not initiated. Fine had come to him with an offer. The letter described it obliquely, in the careful language of a man who knew correspondence could be read, but the shape of it was clear. Someone had sent Fine to approach her father before his death. Someone had made an offer. Her father had declined it. 8 months later, he was dead. She sat with this for a long time. She was aware of her own breathing, aware of the particular stillness of the room around her, the house sounds muted, the afternoon light at its lowest angle through the window. She'd known, abstractly, that her father's death had been connected to the conspiracy against his estate. She'd had fragments of evidence. This was not a fragment. This was a thread that connected Fane to a direct approach before her father's death, which connected Fine to the trustees who benefited afterward, which connected through Morrow to the 6 names on the note, which connected to the midwinter gala in 5 days. She stood up. She walked out of the library. She walked down the corridor to the study and opened the door without knocking. Lucienne was at the desk. Morrow was standing on the other side of it with a document in his hand. Both of them looked at her. She held Morrow's gaze for 1 full second. She watched his face perform the same careful management it always did. The professionalism, the warmth timed precisely. And she watched his eyes, which were not performing anything, which were very still and very sharp, and which told her he had been watching her too, and had been doing so since the night of the first note, and was now recalculating something. "I'm sorry," she said, with perfect pleasantness. "I didn't realize you were in a meeting. I'll come back." She closed the door. She went back to the library. She sat down. She wrote the Fane letter, finding in her notes every detail, everything the letter's language implied about who had sent Fine and what they'd wanted and what her father had understood about it. Then she wrote 1 more line. 5 days. They move at the gala, regardless of what we do between now and then. She underlined it. She was still looking at it when she heard quick footsteps in the corridor, not Lucien's measured pace, something different, faster. And Jess the porter knocked and entered without waiting, his face the same white it had been the night he delivered the second note. He was holding another note. She took it. She opened it. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Lucien in Kaelin Morrow's handwriting, and it had been intercepted. She could see from the seal that it had never been meant to reach the Duke's hands. And it said 3 things. It said that the timeline had been moved. Not the gala. Before the gala. It said that the Duchess had found the Fane correspondence. And it said, "She needs to be dealt with before the 5th day. Confirm." Serafina looked at the note for exactly 4 seconds. Then she walked to the door, opened it, and went directly to the study. Morrow was still there. She walked in, crossed the room, set the note on the desk between them both, and looked at Kaelin Morrow with the complete, unblinking attention she'd spent her entire adult life learning to deploy without flinching. "Confirm what exactly?" she said. The silence that followed was not the silence of an innocent man. Kaelin Morrow did not run. That was the first thing. That was the thing Serafina filed immediately, even as the silence in the study stretched into something that had physical weight and texture. He didn't run, didn't reach for denial, didn't perform the elaborate innocence of a man who'd spent 7 years performing everything else. He stood on the other side of the desk with the note between them and looked at it for 3 full seconds, and when he looked up, his face had shed something. The warmth. The professional calibration. What was left underneath was older and colder and considerably more honest. "How did you get that?" he said. Not a question. A problem being assessed. "Does it matter?" Serafina said. Lucienne hadn't moved. She was aware of him the way she was aware of load-bearing walls, as a structural fact, as something that determined the shape of the space around it. He was standing behind the desk, very still, and she understood without looking directly at him that what was happening in him right now was not the clean strategic anger of a man whose plan had been compromised. It was the other kind. The kind that comes from 7 years of proximity, of trust extended and maintained, of a man who had learned to work without trusting people learning, slowly, against his own instincts, to trust this one. The kind of anger that has grief under it. "Lucien?" Morrow said. "Don't," Lucien said. The single word had the quality of a door being shut, permanently. Morrow looked at him for a moment. Something moved across his face, Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt, something more complicated. The expression of a man who has been two things at once for a very long time and has just been required to be only one of them. You were going to lose everything anyway, Morrow said. That's what you need to understand. I didn't build this. It was already built. I found a way to survive inside it. By helping them dismantle it faster, Lucien said. By ensuring that when it came down, I wasn't under it. The honesty of this was its own kind of brutality. Serafina watched Lucien absorb it and watched him not look away from it, not soften it into something more manageable, and understood that this was what 7 years of genuine, if strategically constructed proximity produced. The specific capacity to hear the truth from someone and recognize it as truth even when the truth was that the someone had been gutting you from the inside. The grain contracts, Lucien said. 3 years ago. Yes. You found the irregularities, brought them to me. I planted them first, Morrow said, then found them. A beat. 2. The border correspondence, Lucien said. The intercepted dispatch from House Villan. Altered, before it reached you. The Harwick negotiation, when Harwick walked away from the table. I told his representative that you described the alliance as temporary and primarily financial. Morrow said this with the flatness of a man reading from a ledger. Which you hadn't, but Harwick believed it because it fit what he already feared about you. Each item landed like something structural being removed. Serafina watched Lucien's face and watched him doing what she'd watched him do with every piece of difficult information since the night of the first note, taking it in completely, without insulating himself from it, without the defensive reflex of disbelief. He was, she thought, one of the most genuinely unsentimental people she had ever encountered, and right now that quality was the only thing keeping this room from becoming something unmanageable. The Vale estate, she said. Morrow's eyes moved to her. That wasn't mine. I coordinated with Brennus's people, but the legal architecture around Lord Vale's holdings, that predates my involvement. But you knew about it. From the beginning. She held his gaze. My father met with Aldrich Fane 8 months before he died. Someone sent Fine to make him an offer. Was that Brennus? Morrow was quiet for a moment. The quiet of calculation, not conscience. Brennus coordinated it, he said. The offer came from Renwick. Your father's estate sat on 3 trade routes that Renwick's family had been trying to acquire for 2 decades. The offer was a buyout, fair market, on paper. Your father declined. And then he died, she said. He was already ill, Morrow said, and she watched him watch her absorb this, and she watched him understand from her face that she didn't entirely believe it, and she watched him decide not to push the point. She filed this. She would return to it. The gala, she said. The original timeline was the gala. You moved it up. Why? For the first time, something flickered in Morrow's composure. Because you found the Fane correspondence. Because you are... He stopped. You weren't supposed to be a factor. Brennus arranged this marriage because he believed Ashcroft would take a compliant wife who'd be grateful for the title and wouldn't look too closely at anything. You were supposed to be contained by your own relief at having a resolution. He miscalculated, Serafina said. Comprehensively, Morrow said. The word contained something she couldn't fully name, not admiration exactly, but recognition. The particular acknowledgement of one person who had spent years operating in information environments for another person who had done the same thing from a position of considerably less power and managed anyway. She didn't assign it value. Not now. What happens in 5 days? She said. The original gala plan. What were they going to do? Morrow looked at Lucien. Lucien said nothing. His face said nothing. But he was listening with the quality of attention that meant he would remember every word verbatim and every inflection for the rest of his life. Frame you shall, Morrow said. Both of you. The Duchess for complicity in the misappropriation of the Vale estate. There's a document prepared, backdated, with a signature that will pass basic forensic examination. Lucien, for the same misappropriation, extended to cover 3 council accounts that Brennus's people have been quietly moving funds through. The accounts connect to Ashcroft House on paper. He paused. The arrest warrants were drafted last week. Renwick was going to present the evidence to the Crown's representative at the gala. Public setting, witnesses, no room for counter-narrative in the moment. The room was very quiet. Serafina thought about the gala. Renwick's ground, Renwick's guest list. The Crown's representatives surrounded by Brennus's allies and Renwick's hospitality. The arrest in public before any defense could be organized. The immediate legal freeze on Ashcroft House's assets and her own remaining holdings. The time it would take to challenge the forensic document, during which they would both be held, separated, managed. The elegance of it was nauseating. The new timeline, Lucien said. His voice had not changed in temperature or volume since the first moment. What's moving? I don't know the full detail, Moreau said. Don't, Lucien said. Moreau closed his mouth. You sent that note, Lucien said. You confirmed she'd found the Fane correspondence. Which means Brennus knows. Which means whatever the accelerated timeline is, it started the moment you sent that confirmation. How long ago did you send it? Moreau said nothing. Kalin. Lucien said his name the way you say the name of someone who no longer exists in the form you knew them. How long ago? An hour before she walked in, Moreau said. Lucien moved. Not dramatically, not fast. The controlled, deliberate movement of a man who has made a decision and is executing it without wasted motion. He crossed to the door and pulled it open, and Jess was in the corridor, hovering with the anxiety of a man who understood that something significant was happening and didn't know what he was supposed to do about it. Fine thing, Lucien said. Now, and close the house. Jess went. Lucien came back. He looked at Moreau with the complete, leveled attention that Serafina had watched him deploy on problems he intended to solve. You're going to tell me everything, he said. The document, where it was prepared, who holds it, whether it's the only copy, the council accounts, the Crown's representative and who managed that relationship. Everything. And you're going to tell me in the next 30 minutes. And if I don't? Then I have enough without your cooperation to ensure that whatever happens to me, you're included in the accounting. And the version of events that gets told without your input will be the version that assigns you the maximum available culpability. He paused. Or you can give me the 30 minutes, and I can give you the specific thing you said you wanted 7 years ago, a way to survive inside whatever comes down. Moreau looked at him for a long moment. Serafina watched something work itself out behind his eyes. The arithmetic of a man who had been calculating survival for so long that it had replaced every other consideration, running the numbers one more time. Start with the document, Lucien said. Moreau started with the document. Chotat. The 30 minutes became 90. Serafina wrote everything. Her hand cramped at the 40-minute mark and she kept writing. Moreau talked with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had held this architecture in his head for years and found, in the release of it, something she hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but the strange unlocking of a person who has been one thing for so long that becoming something else, even in collapse, had its own terrible quality of freedom. What they had at the end of it was devastating. The forged document was held by a notary operating out of the Renwick Estate's legal offices. There were 2 copies, one for the gala presentation, one held in reserve at a council-controlled archive. The Crown's representative, a Lord Inspector named Cavendish, had been managed through Brennus's social network over 18 months. Dinners, introductions, the slow accumulation of a relationship built on the assumption that when the moment came he would trust his host's framing over the accused's defense. The council accounts had been moved through a series of intermediary transactions designed to terminate, on paper, at Ashcroft House's secondary ledger. The ledger Moreau had helped design. And one more thing. One thing that Moreau offered at the 90-minute mark, unprompted, with the particular quality of a man lightening a load he'd been carrying past the point of endurance, her father's death. He didn't die of illness, Moreau said. Not naturally. I don't know who specifically. I was kept outside that. But the progression was managed. There was someone in his household. The room was very quiet. Serafina put her pen down. She was aware of her own heartbeat. Aware of the specific quality of stillness that her body produced when something it had suspected for 3 years was confirmed in spoken words. She'd suspected. She'd had fragments. She'd told herself, in the rational part of her mind, That suspicion without proof was a thing you set aside and returned to when you had the capacity to act on it. She had not apparently successfully set it aside. Because what was happening in her chest right now was not the clean response to new information. It was the response to old information finally being allowed to exist without containment. She picked the pen back up. "Name of the household contact," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "I don't have it," Morrow said. "Genuinely, that was Brennis's direct operation. I was told only that it was done and that it was clean." She wrote, "Brennis, direct chain to Vale household, identify contact." She underlined it. Lucienne was looking at her. She didn't look back at him. She didn't want what she would see in his face right now. Whatever it was, concern or the particular quality of attention he deployed on things that mattered to him. Because she needed to stay in the register she was in, the cold, functional register, and whatever he would give her with that look would compromise it. "Lock him in the east room," she said, "the one with the single window and no direct access to the corridor." "Serafina, he's given us what he has. He stays contained until we've verified it, because if any part of what he's told us is misdirection, we need him accessible." She stood up. She looked at Morrow. "If it's accurate, I'll consider the cooperation. If it's not, I won't." Morrow looked at her for a moment. "You're going to go after Brennis," he said, directly. "Yes. He has 3 times the resource base and institutional protection that—" "I know what he has," she said. "I've been studying it for 3 years." She walked out of the study. She went to her room. She needed 4 minutes of silence, and she gave herself exactly that, sitting at the desk with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the middle distance, letting the information settle into the structure of everything she'd already built without trying to process the personal weight of it. The personal weight was real. It was not small. Her father had not died of illness. He had been killed by people who wanted his trade routes and found the legal mechanisms of estate seizure insufficient on their own timeline. She had 4 minutes for this. Then she stood up, washed her face, and went back to work. Lucienne found her in the library 20 minutes later. She had the Renwick financial file open alongside her notes from Morrow's account and was working through the connection points, looking for the one piece of documentary evidence that could be produced in a public setting and survive independent scrutiny. He sat down across from her without speaking. He put a glass of water in front of her. She hadn't noticed she was thirsty until she saw it, and opened the correspondence files on his side of the table. They worked in silence for an hour. "The notary," she said finally. "Aldrich Fine has a working relationship with the notary who holds the forged document. Morrow confirmed it. If Fine can be pressured—" "Fine is afraid of Brennis," Lucian said. "Fine is afraid of Brennis when Brennis is the only danger in the room," she said. "If there's a more immediate and certain danger, you want to create a more immediate and certain danger. I want to give Fine a clear calculation. Brennis's consequence if he cooperates with us versus our consequence if he doesn't." She looked up. "What can you bring to bear on Fane independently, without Brennis's network being able to absorb it?" Lucienne was quiet for a moment. "The Duchy has authority over legal practice licenses within Crestmore's administrative district. Fine's practice operates within that district. Can you move on it in 24 hours? "If I have grounds." "I have grounds," she said. "The Fane letter from my father's correspondence establishes direct contact with a man whose practice subsequently benefited from the death of the person he approached. Combined with Morrow's account isn't signed testimony." "Not yet," she said. He looked at her. "You think he'll sign it?" "I think when I go back to that room and explain to him exactly what his signed testimony is worth versus what his silence is worth, he'll make the calculation he always makes." She paused. "He's not loyal to Brennis. He was never loyal to Brennis. He was loyal to his own survival. I'm offering him a better survival than Brennis can. And if he signs, then we have grounds for Fine. And if Fine breaks—" She stopped, looked at the file. "We have the forged document in our possession before the gala. And without the document, Brennis's plan at the gala is a political claim without physical evidence, which changes everything about how Cavendish responds." Outside, the early dark of the season had settled fully. The house was quiet in the specific way of a household that had been told to close itself. the particular muffled quality of locked doors and pulled shutters and staff who understood that something was happening without knowing what. Serafina's hand found the ledger and stopped. There was a sound from the lower floor. Not guests' feet, not Mirathane's economical movement. Something else. Multiple sets of feet. The specific quality of sound that a house makes when people enter it who were not invited. She and Lucien both lifted their heads at the same instant. He was on his feet before she was. She was around the table and at the door a step behind him. He opened it. Jest was at the top of the stairs. His face was the white of a man who had just understood something terrible. "Your Grace," he said, "there are men in the courtyard, council livery. They have a crown warrant." He looked at Serafina. "For the Duchess. Immediate detainment. Charges of fraud against the crown estate and complicity in the misappropriation of—" "They moved the document," Lucien said. He said it with the flat, total certainty of a man who has just watched a trap close. "Not 5 days. Not the gala. Now." Serafina looked at the stairs. She looked at Lucien. She felt with complete clarity the specific geometry of the trap. They'd accelerated because Morrow's confirmation told them she'd found the feigned letter. The warrant was for her specifically, not for Lucien. The choice is yours, Duchess, not his, designed to separate them, to remove her from Ashcroft House, and from everything she'd built in the last 19 days, to put her in a position where the only negotiating currency she had was compliance. They were right now betting that Lucien would let her go, that the marriage was thin enough, recent enough, practically motivated enough that when it cost him something real to defend her, he would perform a calculated retreat. They didn't know what had happened in this house over 19 days. She looked at Lucien and found him already looking at her. "The East Room," she said. "Get Morrow's signed testimony. Right now, whatever it takes." She turned toward the stairs. "I'll go down." "Serafina, they'll breach the door in 10 minutes if I don't. That gives you 10 minutes with Morrow." She looked at him directly, the same way she'd looked at him across the altar, the same refusal to be the one who looked away first. "Don't let them take the ledger, the Renwick file, the correspondence, all of it. Do not let them into this house." She reached under her skirt. She unstrapped the dagger from the ribbon garter. She looked at it for 1 second, plain steel, functional, the weight her father had selected for her hand. And she looked at Lucien, and she put it in his hand. "I'll need that back," she said. She walked to the stairs. She walked down them with her spine straight, and her hands visible, and her face the face she'd developed over 3 years of navigating rooms full of people who held her future in their hands, composed, unreadable, and hiding nothing that mattered. Behind her, she heard Lucien's footsteps going fast toward the East Room. Below her, the councilmen were in the entry hall. And in the courtyard beyond them, she understood with complete cold certainty Brennus had just made the mistake that would end him. He had forced her into the open, separated her from everything she'd built, and in doing so had given her the only position from which she was genuinely dangerous. A trapped animal is afraid. She had stopped being afraid on the morning of her wedding. She walked into the entry hall and looked at the council warrant and said, quietly and without inflection, "I'll need a moment to retrieve my coat." In the 10 seconds of confusion this produced, she memorized every face in the room, cataloged every weakness she could read from body language and posture, and began building the next plan. They put her in a carriage, not a prison wagon, say. They were more careful than that, or Brennus was more careful than that, because the optics of dragging a duchess through the city streets in chains required a specific kind of public confidence he hadn't yet earned. The carriage was council livery, curtained, with 2 men inside and 2 on the roof, and it moved through the city with the deliberate pace of something that wanted to be seen as routine. Serafina sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and cataloged everything. The men inside with her were not council clerks. They had the posture of men trained to physical function, wearing administrative clothing as a costume. The one on her left had a blade at his hip under the formal coat. She could see the line of it when he shifted. The one on her right had his hands loose and his weight slightly forward, the specific readiness of someone waiting for a problem to handle. She was not going to be a problem. Not yet. She watched the city through the gap at the curtain's edge. She was mapping the route, and the route was not toward the Crown's administrative offices, where a legitimate detainment under warrant would have taken her. It was moving west, toward the outer districts. Toward, she calculated after the third turn, the Renwick Estate's secondary property, a large house on the Cassian Road that she'd identified in the financial records 3 days ago as a location where significant operational expenses had been logged without corresponding documented activity. They weren't taking her to the Crown's custody. They were taking her to Renwick's. This changed the calculation in two directions simultaneously. It meant the warrant was theater, real in its legal construction, but not being executed through legitimate channels, which meant Brennus didn't fully control Lord Inspector Cavendish yet, or wasn't certain enough of that control to put her in front of him immediately, which meant there was still a window. And it meant that wherever she was going, the people running this operation needed her accessible for some purpose that required privacy rather than public institutional process. They needed something from her. She sat with this and let it clarify. They needed her signature. The forged document, Morrow had described a signature prepared to pass basic forensic examination, which meant it was good but not perfect, which meant that in a serious legal challenge it might not hold. A real signature, obtained under whatever pressure they intended to apply in a private location, would be considerably more durable. They needed her to sign something, which meant they needed her functional, uninjured, coherent enough to hold a pen, which meant she had, for the duration of whatever time it took them to reach the Renwick property and begin that process, leverage she hadn't had when she walked down the stairs at Ashcroft House. She breathed. She thought about Lucien and the 10 minutes she'd given him and whether 10 minutes had been enough, and she set this aside because thinking about it didn't change it, and she needed her mind on the room ahead of her rather than the one behind. The carriage stopped. The house on Cassian Road was large and deliberately anonymous, the kind of property that wealth maintains for purposes it doesn't want associated with its primary address. They took her through a side entrance, down a corridor with covered windows, into a room on the ground floor that had 2 chairs, a writing desk, and Lord Castellan Brennus. He looked, in person, exactly like the man she'd watched smile at the conclusion of her wedding ceremony. Heavy-shouldered, mid-60s, with the particular solidity of someone who had spent 4 decades accumulating power through the patient exploitation of institutional structures. He was not, she noted, a man who looked like he expected trouble. He looked like a man conducting a meeting he'd already concluded. "Duchess Ashcroft," he said. "I apologize for the circumstances. This is a delicate situation, and I needed to ensure it was managed carefully." "You mean privately?" she said. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat because standing was a performance, and she was conserving performance for when it mattered. "Your husband is a formidable man," Brennus said. "I've always respected that. But he has made consistent errors in judgment regarding who he chooses to trust. You've been in that house 3 weeks, and you've already been used to destabilize what took us years to build." He said this without particular anger, the assessment of a project manager encountering an unexpected variable. "I don't blame you for that. You were given access and you used it. That's rational behavior." "I'm going to assume there's a document on that desk," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "There is. And you need my signature on it. Your voluntary cooperation would significantly simplify what would otherwise be a more difficult situation for everyone involved." "My voluntary cooperation," she said. "In exchange for what specifically?" "The Vale holdings. Restored in full to your direct administration. No council oversight, no trustees." He paused. "And your continued freedom of movement. Lord Inspector Cavendish has been made aware of the evidence against you. Whether that evidence proceeds to formal prosecution is, at this point, a matter of how this conversation concludes." She looked at the desk. She thought about her father, who had sat across from Aldrich Fane and heard an offer and declined it, and who had died 8 months later in a manner that Brennus had described to his associates as managed. She thought about what it meant that they were having this conversation in a private room on Cassian Road rather than in a Crown office. And she thought about what Lucien was doing with the 10 minutes she'd given him and the dagger she'd put in his hand. And she thought about 19 days of accumulated documentation and Morrow's signed testimony and the specific architecture of the trap Brennus had built and the specific architecture of the counter trap she and Lucien had been building inside it. She thought about what her father would have done. "No," she said. Brennus looked at her, not surprised, assessing. "You understand what I can bring to bear. I understand completely, she said. I've spent 3 years studying what you can bring to bear. I've spent the last 19 days documenting it. She met his eyes. You moved your timeline because you found out I'd located the Fane correspondence, which means you know I can connect Fine to your operation, which means you know the forged document becomes significantly less effective if I can demonstrate its construction, which is why you need my signature, not to supplement the forgery but to replace it, because you're not certain the forgery holds. The room was very quiet. Where is the original? She said. The document Morrow described, the one prepared at the Renwick notary. I want to see it. That's not. If you want me to sign anything, I want to see what I'd be replacing. She held his gaze. That's the negotiation. Show me the document. He looked at her for 3 seconds. He reached into the case beside his chair and put the document on the desk between them. She looked at it. She looked at the signature, her name, in a hand that was close and not close enough, the particular pressure of pen on paper that belonged to someone who had studied her writing without having her actual writing history to study against. She looked at the date and the clause structure and the specific language of the admission it contained. She looked at the corner of the document where the notary seal was stamped. The seal was Fane's notary registration. She had exactly the time it took to register this before the window on the east wall broke inward. Mom, not dramatically. Not the cinematic explosion of glass and force she might have imagined. One clean impact, the window giving, and then Jest was through it. Jest, the porter, who she'd never seen move faster than a measured walk, coming through a ground-floor window with the controlled urgency of a man who had been told exactly what to do and was doing it. And behind him, through the door that the 2 men in the corridor had been managing, she heard the specific sounds of a situation being physically resolved. She picked up the document from the desk. She folded it. She put it inside her dress. Brennus was on his feet. His face had finally shed the administrative composure, and what was under it was the face of a man watching a structure he'd spent years building develop cracks in load-bearing places. He reached for something at the edge of the desk. She didn't wait to see what it was. She stood, put the chair between them, and moved toward the broken window. Jest was already outside, holding the frame clear. She went through. The side yard of the Renwick property was a narrow strip of gravel and dead grass between the house wall and the perimeter fence. 3 men were on the ground in various states of incapacitation. Standing over the nearest of them with a blade in his right hand and blood on his left forearm that he was not visibly concerned about was Lucien. He looked at her. The quality of his attention in that moment was not the careful, measured thing she'd come to know across the reading table. It was stripped of all the management, all the controlled deployment of self. It was direct and absolute, and it did something to her chest that she was going to deal with later. Are you hurt? He said. No, you are. It's nothing. Do you have it? She put her hand against the front of her dress where the document was. I have it. Something moved through his face. One beat, unguarded. Then it was gone and he was moving, and she was moving with him. And Jest was 3 steps ahead with the focused efficiency of a man who had been told the route and was running it. They went over the perimeter fence. They went through the alley on the far side. There was a carriage waiting. Not council livery. A plain dark vehicle with a driver she didn't recognize, and 2 men on the rear board who she clocked as the Duke's household guard, the ones she'd noted in her first week as the staff members who moved differently from the others. They got in. The carriage moved. Inside, in the jolting dark, she got her first real look at his arm. The cut was 4 inches along the outer forearm, not deep enough to be immediately dangerous, but bleeding steadily, and he was holding it with his right hand with the practiced economy of a man who had done this particular form of self-maintenance before. She took off the scarf at her neck. She wrapped it. He let her, watching the street through the curtain gap with the focused attention of a man tracking whether they were followed. Morrow signed, he said. All of it? Everything he gave us verbally, witnessed by Thane and one of the household guard. He paused. It took 6 minutes. He didn't fight it. I told you he wouldn't. You told me. He glanced at her. The document, if it's Fane's seal, it is. Which means Fine prepared it. Which means Fine's testimony, combined with Morrow's, combined with the Renwick financial records, is enough to challenge the forgery at a level that requires an independent Crown inquiry rather than a council majority vote. She tied off the scarf. "We need Cavendish." "Lord Inspector Cavendish is at the Renwick Estate main house," Lucian said. "He arrived this evening. Brennus's people have been managing his information environment for 18 months. He believes he's attending a preliminary evidence review." "Then we go to the Renwick Estate main house," she said. He looked at her. "They've already moved the timeline once," she said. "They know you came for me. They know I have the document. In an hour, Brennus will have reframed everything that happened tonight as the Duke's interference with a legitimate Crown process, and Cavendish will have heard that version first." She met his eyes. "We don't have an hour." "The Renwick estate has significant private security." "I know. I read the accounts." "Serafina, what I have inside my dress," she said, "combined with what you have in your coat from Morrow, is enough to end this. Tonight. In front of Cavendish, before Brennus gets to him." She held his gaze. "Or we wait and let them control the narrative and spend the next 6 months fighting a legal battle with our assets frozen and our witnesses subject to pressure." She paused. "I know what I'm asking." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him run it, the actual calculation, not the performed reluctance of a man who wanted to be persuaded, but the real arithmetic of risk and resource and the specific geography of what they had versus what they were walking into. "The driver knows the Renwick Estate service entrance," he said. "I know," she said. "I told him before I came downstairs." The look he gave her then was the one she still didn't have a complete name for. She was getting closer to naming it. She was deliberately not rushing the process. He leaned forward and gave the driver the instruction. Quote, "The Renwick Estate main house was everything the secondary property wasn't. Visible, formal, blazing with the light of a household entertaining a Crown official. They went in through the service entrance, which the driver knew because Serafina had spent 2 days identifying every member of Renwick's household staff who had reason to be unhappy with their employer, and the underbutler who opened the service gate had been underpaid for 3 years and had received, the previous week, an anonymous letter outlining exactly what his employer had been doing with the estate's financial surplus. Some tools required months to build. Some required only accurate information delivered at the right moment. They went through the kitchen corridor. Lucien moved the way he'd moved in the side yard of Cassian Road, with the contained efficiency of a man who has decided what he's doing and is executing without wasted motion. His arm was still bleeding through the scarf. He didn't mention it. She didn't either. She could hear, from the direction of the formal reception rooms, the sounds of an evening gathering. Crystal, low music, the specific murmur of a curated social event. Cavendish would be in there. Brennus might already be back. They didn't know his route from the Cassian Road property, and they didn't have the luxury of certainty. She put her hand on Lucien's arm and stopped him at the corridor junction. She looked at him directly. "Whatever happens in that room," she said, "when I put the document on the table, you do not speak first." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because they expect you to. Because they've spent years building a story about the Duke of Cressmore, and every story they've told about you starts with you taking an action and them responding. If you speak first, you're in their frame." She held his eyes. "Cavendish doesn't know me. I'm the wrong party, not the feared one. I'm harder to dismiss." A beat. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've thought about nothing else for 3 weeks." Something in his face. That thing again. She was very close to naming it now. "After you," he said. She turned to the corridor that led to the formal rooms. She straightened her spine the same way she'd straightened it on the stairs at Ashcroft House. She put her hand against her dress one more time, felt the document there, solid and real. She thought about her father and what he'd been offered and what it had cost him to refuse. She thought about the specific arithmetic of people who acquire power by making others believe they have no options, and how completely that arithmetic fails the moment someone stops believing it. She pushed open the door to the formal reception room. 40 people. Crystal and candlelight, and the very specific silence that descends on a room when something enters it that isn't supposed to be there. Lord Renwick at the far end, his face shifting through surprise into the practiced recovery of a man who'd handled unexpected variables before. Brennus was not there, not yet, or not visible. And at the center of the room, in conversation with 2 men she didn't recognize, a lean figure in Crown Inspector's formal wear who turned at the silence and found her across the length of the room. Lord Inspector Cavendish. She walked toward him. She heard Lucien's footsteps behind her, measured and even, and the room parted in the way rooms part for a man whose stillness cost something. She stopped 4 feet from Cavendish. She reached into her dress and put the document on the table beside him. She put Morrow's signed testimony beside it. She put the 3 pages of Lucien's handwritten summary of the Renwick financial irregularities beside that. She looked at Cavendish with the complete, unblinking attention she'd spent her entire life learning. "My name is Seraphina Ashcroft, Duchess of Crestmore," she said. "I was abducted from my home tonight under a fraudulent Crown warrant, taken to a private property on Cassian Road, and presented with this document and asked to sign it." She touched the forgery without picking it up. "The notary seal belongs to one Aldrich Fane, whose signed statement regarding his role in its preparation is in the second document. The third document outlines the financial irregularities in Lord Renwick's estate accounts that underpin this entire operation." She paused. "I am requesting, formally and on the record, an immediate independent Crown inquiry." The room was so quiet she could hear the candles. Cavendish looked at the documents. He looked at her. He looked at Lucien, standing 1 step behind her with blood showing through the makeshift bandage on his forearm, and the particular quality of controlled stillness that made every person in a room suddenly aware of how much they stood to lose. Cavendish reached for the testimony. And from the doorway behind them, Brennus said, "Lord Inspector, I can explain what you're looking at." Seraphina did not turn around. She watched Cavendish's eyes instead, and what she watched was a man reading the first paragraph of Morrow's testimony and going very still, and then reading the second paragraph, and then looking up not at Brennus but at her, with the expression of a man who has just understood the shape of something he was standing inside without knowing it. "Lord Brennus," Cavendish said, without looking up from the testimony, "I think you should stay where you are." Brennus took 1 more step into the room. The 2 men who had entered with Lucien, household guard, positioned at either side of the door before anyone had tracked them moving there, stepped forward. Seraphina turned then. She turned and looked at Brennus directly for the first time, and she looked at him with the face of a woman who had spent 3 years being managed and contained and legally stripped, and had spent the last 19 days converting every one of those years into something actionable. He looked back at her, and she watched him run his calculation 1 final time, the arithmetic of a man counting his assets against a changed landscape, and she watched him reach the end of the calculation. His face told her what he found there. She turned back to Cavendish. "There's 1 more thing," she said. "I need to discuss with you the circumstances surrounding the death of Lord Aldrich Vale, my father." She held Cavendish's eyes. "I have reason to believe it wasn't from natural causes." The silence that followed was the silence of a room that had just become a completely different room. Behind her, she heard Brennus move. Not toward the door, not the retreat of a man conceding. The other kind of movement. The desperate, cornered kind that men make when the calculation runs out and instinct takes over from strategy. Lucien moved faster. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Cavendish, on the testimony in his hands, on the 40 witnesses in the room, and she heard the specific sounds of the struggle behind her. Brief, controlled, the sounds of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, ending something quickly, and she felt the exact moment the room's weight shifted permanently. Cavendish set down the testimony. He looked at the doorway where 2 of his own staff had materialized from the formal entrance. He looked at Renwick, whose face had gone the gray of a man watching an edifice collapse. He looked at Seraphina. "I'll need a full account," he said. "Tonight. From both of you." "You'll have it," she said. She reached back without looking, and Lucien's hand found hers. Not the formal clasp of a ceremony, not the careful maintenance of appropriate distance, but the direct and uncalculated grip of a man who had just finished doing something violent in defense of something that mattered to him and needed 1 second of contact with the thing that mattered. She held on, 1 second. Then they both let go and turned to the work. The accounting took 4 hours. Cavendish was thorough in the way that men are thorough when they understand they are sitting inside a catastrophic institutional failure, and their own legacy depends on how cleanly they address it. He asked his questions without theater, without the performance of authority, with the focused precision of someone who needed to understand the complete architecture before he could begin dismantling any part of it. Serafina answered everything. Lucien answered everything. The documents were examined, cross-referenced, set in order on the long table in Renwick's formal dining room, while Renwick himself sat at the far end under the quiet supervision of 2 Crown staff members and said almost nothing. Brennus was in a separate room. She didn't see him again that night. By the time Cavendish closed his portfolio and looked across the table at them both, the candles had burned low and the sounds of the city outside had gone to the particular quiet of the hours before dawn. "I'm going to need both of you available for the formal proceedings," he said. "That will take approximately 3 weeks to schedule. During that time, the Ashcroft accounts remain unfrozen. The original warrant is void pending my review, which I'm initiating tonight. The Vale Estate Administration transfers to direct Crown oversight until the proceedings conclude." He paused. "After which, based on what I have in front of me, I would expect full restoration." "The investigation into my father's death," Serafina said. Cavendish looked at her. "That becomes a separate matter, longer, more complex." He held her gaze. "I won't promise you a timeline. I will promise you it will be taken seriously." She nodded once. She'd learned over 3 years the difference between a promise made to manage someone and a promise made with the weight of genuine intention behind it. She believed this one. They left Renwick's estate as the sky was beginning to gray at its eastern edge. In the carriage, in the silence that follows the end of something that has consumed every available resource for weeks, she sat with her hands in her lap and let the exhaustion that she'd been holding at arm's length finally arrive. Lucien sat across from her. His arm had been properly bandaged by one of Cavendish's staff at some point in the middle of the night. He was looking out the window at the city moving past, and she watched his face in profile and watched it carry something that she hadn't seen in it before. Not the aftermath of battle, not the cool competence of a man who had executed a plan and was reviewing its results. Something older and less managed than that. "You're thinking about Morrow," she said. He didn't look away from the window immediately. When he did, his eyes had the quality of someone who had decided to stop managing what they showed. 7 years, he said. "I keep coming back to it. Not the betrayal. I understand the betrayal." He made a calculation. He'd been making it since the beginning. He was quiet for a moment. "I keep coming back to the question of what I missed, what I chose not to see." "You didn't choose not to see it," she said. "He was specifically constructed to be invisible in that position." "I know that. But knowing it doesn't help." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She looked at him for a moment. "My father trusted someone in his household," she said. "Someone managed his illness. I've spent 3 years being angry at him for that, for being someone that could be gotten to." She paused. "I stopped being angry at him sometime in the last few weeks. I'm not certain exactly when." He looked at her. "Because I understand now that it's not a failure of intelligence," she said. "Trusting people who are specifically designed to be trusted. It's just what happens when you're human and you're in proximity to other humans for long enough." She met his eyes. "It doesn't mean you were weak. It means they worked harder at the deception than you worked at the suspicion, which is actually something about them, not about you." He was quiet for a long time. The city outside was beginning to wake. First light, the earliest sounds of commerce. The specific tone of a morning that doesn't know it's the first morning of a different situation. "You're going to make a very effective duchess," he said. There was something in the way he said it, not the administrative compliment, not the strategic acknowledgement. The other thing. The thing that had been accumulating, she understood now, since the night in the library when they'd first spread their separate research across the same table and discovered that 2 people working the same problem in isolation had been, together, considerably less isolated than either of them had believed. "I've been one for 3 weeks," she said. "I intend to be considerably more effective in the 2nd month." The corner of his mouth moved. She'd been watching for that specific movement since the 3rd day, and she never quite got used to it. They went home. Parted. The formal proceedings were, as Cavendish had indicated, 3 weeks in scheduling and 2 weeks in execution. They were not simple. Brennus had resources she hadn't fully mapped, and the process of dismantling the legal architecture he'd built over years required the kind of sustained, meticulous effort that couldn't be hurried without creating vulnerabilities. There were days when the machinery seemed to move backward, a piece of evidence challenged, a procedural motion filed, a witness who retreated from an earlier position under pressure from some quarter that couldn't be immediately identified. She handled these days the same way she handled everything, systematically, without allowing the setbacks to destabilize the overall structure of the case. She sat in the proceedings every day. She reviewed every document. She asked questions through their legal representatives that were so precisely targeted that on the fourth day of testimony, one of Brennus's advocates looked at her across the chamber with an expression she recognized as the moment a person stops underestimating someone. Lucien sat beside her every day. He didn't perform solidarity. He was simply present, in the particular way he was present in every room, completely, without reservation, with the full weight of his attention on the thing in front of him. On the days when the proceedings went badly, she watched him absorb the difficulty without externalizing it, without the compensatory performances that people deploy to demonstrate that they haven't been affected. He was affected. He simply didn't confuse being affected with being compromised. She found, over those 5 weeks, that she was building a new vocabulary for him. Not the vocabulary of assessment, she'd had that since the second week, but something with more texture. The particular way his thinking moved when he was working on a problem he hadn't yet solved. The specific quality of silence he produced when he was angry. That was different from the silence he produced when he was thinking. The way he spoke to Mira Thane in the mornings, direct and without ceremony, but never without the baseline acknowledgement that Thane's 19 years in that household had earned her. The way he looked at the arm where the scar was forming, not with drama, not with the romanticization of injury, but with the slightly abstracted expression of a man cataloging a permanent alteration to his physical landscape and deciding it was acceptable. She was building this vocabulary in parallel with the legal proceedings and the investigation into her father's death, and she was aware that she was doing it, and she did not stop. The sentence came down on a Thursday morning in late winter. Brennus received the full weight of what the evidence supported: fraud against the crown, conspiracy to obstruct justice, coordinated financial misappropriation across 4 noble houses. The proceedings had revealed, in their 5th week, 2 additional co-conspirators whose names had not appeared on the original note, which told her the network had been larger than even Morrow had known. All of it came down in a 2-hour session that felt, after the months of preparation, both enormous and strangely quiet. Renwick lost his estate and his title. 3 of the 6 names lost their counsel positions. The notary who had prepared the forged document, not Fine, who had cooperated in exchange for a reduced consequence, lost his practice license and received a custodial sentence. Brennus lost everything. The council seat, the accumulated holdings, the institutional protection that had made him appear for 4 decades untouchable. She sat across the chamber from him as the determination was read and watched his face and found, in the watching, that she didn't have what she'd expected to have. The satisfaction she'd anticipated, the clean, complete feeling of a wrong being righted, of 3 years of systematic loss being answered, wasn't there in the form she'd imagined. What was there instead was something quieter and more complicated. The recognition that even a complete legal victory didn't undo the specific things that had been done. Her father was still dead. The 3 years were still gone. The person she'd been before she learned, at the top of the stairs at 19, how quickly the ground could disappear beneath you. That person wasn't coming back, and she'd stopped, somewhere in the last month, wanting her back. That person hadn't known what she knew now, hadn't been capable of what she was capable of now. The cost of what she'd become had been real, and it had been paid in things she couldn't recover. And what she was sitting with now, in the chamber as Brennus's face went gray, was the first genuine understanding that recovery and restoration were not the same thing, and that she was going to have to learn the difference. She was sitting with this when Lucien's hand found hers under the table, not the grip from the Renwick estate, the raw, unguarded contact of the immediate aftermath. This was different, deliberate, quiet, the specific weight of a choice. She looked at his hand and then at his face and found him looking at the front of the chamber, his expression its habitual outward neutrality, except that she knew him well enough now to read the layer under it. She turned her hand over. They held on until the session ended. The investigation into her father's death identified the household contact in the 6th week. A man named Paris, who had worked in the Vale estate's kitchen for 4 years before Aldrich Vale's illness began. He had been moved, after the death, to a position in one of Brennus's secondary properties, where he had remained until the Crown investigators located him. He was no longer alive to give testimony. He had died of a genuine illness 18 months prior. But the paper trail of his employment and his payments from a Brennus-adjacent account was sufficient for the formal determination. Serafina received the investigator's report on a Tuesday afternoon. She read it twice at the desk in the library. She put it down and looked out the window at the formal garden, which was in the first bare beginnings of the season's change. The frost not yet gone, but the ground underneath beginning to shift towards something else. She sat there for a long time. She thought about her father at his desk in the study she'd watched being cleared. She thought about the key around his neck while he slept. She thought about the specific quality of his attention when he'd taught her to read a business document, to look past the surface language to the structural intent underneath, to ask not what something said, but what it was designed to put. She thought about the conversation she'd never been able to have with him about why he'd refused Fane's offer, whether he'd known what refusal would cost, whether knowing had changed anything for him. She thought it probably hadn't. She thought that was something she'd inherited. She was still at the window when Lucian came in. He didn't knock. The door was open, and he came to stand beside her without asking what she was looking at or filling the silence with the careful management of someone who didn't know how to be present with difficult things. He looked at the garden with her. After a while she said, he knew. When Fane came to him with the offer, he knew what it meant that they were making it, and he refused anyway. Yes, Lucian said. That's where I get it from. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the garden, at the bare branch trees and the frost-gray ground, and the particular quality of winter light that promises nothing and withholds nothing at the same time. The thing where knowing the cost doesn't change the decision. I used to think that was stubbornness. I think now it might just be the clearest way to live. He was quiet for a moment. Knowing it will cost you and doing it anyway. Knowing exactly what it will cost you, she said, and doing it anyway because the alternative is becoming something you don't recognize. She felt him look at her. She turned. His face, in the winter light, had the quality she'd first seen in it at the altar and misread as coldness, the complete absence of protective performance. The face of someone who had stopped, some years ago, spending energy on the management of how he appeared, and had put all of that energy into the reality of what he was, and had paid the price of that in isolation, in the reputation for fearsome unreachability, in the years of operating entirely alone inside the armor that other people's stories had built around him. She understood, looking at him, that the armor and the man inside it had been at war with each other for a long time. That the war had been quieting in the last 6 weeks in ways she'd watched without naming. I need to tell you something, he said. All right. I arranged this marriage for strategic reasons, he said. I want to be honest about that. Brennus's plan required a response, and the response I could construct most quickly involved accepting the terms he'd set while changing the variables inside them. I didn't arrange it because... He stopped. Something moved in his jaw. I want you to have the accurate history, not a version that makes me seem better than I was at the start of it. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. You know. I worked it out around day 4, she said. You accepted the marriage terms because accepting them gave you an inside position that refusing them wouldn't have. It also, incidentally, gave me a base of operations and legal standing I wouldn't have had otherwise. So the strategic decision had compound effects you may not have fully anticipated. She held his gaze. I chose to work with what it produced rather than what it began as. That was my decision, made with full information. He looked at her. Something in his face was doing the thing she'd been watching it do for 6 weeks, the slow arrival of an expression that had been forming since the first night in the library when she'd turned the ledger around and showed him what she'd built alone. And he'd looked at it with the face of a man who had not expected to find an equal in the room and was recalculating everything about the situation accordingly. What it produced, he said. Yes, she said. And what do you consider that to be? She She looked at him steadily. Someone I trust, she said. Completely. Which is not something I expected to be able to say to anyone for a very long time, after everything. She paused. And someone who trusts me, which I think might be rarer for you than it is for me, so I want to say it directly. I know what it cost you to let me in. I know what it cost you to take the 10 minutes I asked for and not try to come after me immediately. I know what it cost you every time you gave me accurate information instead of a managed version. She held his eyes. I don't take any of it for granted. The winter light was moving through the window, slow and even. The way light moves when there is nothing dramatic left to illuminate, and it can simply be what it is. He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face. Not the grip of crisis, not the formal contact of ceremony, the direct, unhurried gesture of a man who had decided something and was no longer waiting for a better moment to act on it. I would do it again, he said. Everything, the 10 minutes, every piece of accurate information, all of it. His voice was low and without decoration. Not as a strategy. I want you to have that distinction. I know the difference, she said. She put her hand over his. They stayed that way for a while, in the library where they'd built the case that had ended Brennus, in the room that had become over 6 weeks of shared purpose and honest argument and the specific intimacy of two people who had chosen to stop protecting themselves from each other, something that felt more like home than any room she'd occupied in the 3 years of her displacement. Outside, the season was turning. Not arrived yet, but turning. The first suggestion of something coming that would be warmer and less bare. But 3 months later, on an evening in spring, she found him in the study. He was at the desk, not working, which was unusual enough that she paused in the doorway. He was looking at something on the surface of the desk, and his expression was the thoughtful, slightly abstracted one she associated with him encountering something that required the vocabulary he didn't always have readily available. She crossed the room and looked at what he was looking at. The dagger. Plain steel, dark horn grip, 4 inches of functional blade in its worn leather sheath. She'd put it in a display case in the study 3 weeks after the proceedings concluded. Not prominently, not as a trophy, but in the way you keep something that contains the memory of a significant decision. She'd assumed he'd noticed it and hadn't mentioned it because he was a man who gave space to things that belonged to other people's interior histories. Apparently he'd been waiting for the right moment to ask. You kept it, he said. She came around the desk and stood beside him. They looked at it together. It was the last thing my father gave me, she said, and it was what I walked into your life carrying. She paused. I thought that deserved to be visible somewhere, not hidden away. He looked at it for another moment. The morning of the wedding, he said, when I told you to keep it. I want you to know I wasn't performing generosity. I genuinely didn't know what you were going to need it for. I just knew that a woman who'd arrived at that situation with a weapon had made a decision that I had no right to undo. I know, she said. I knew that morning. It was the first thing you did that didn't fit the story I'd been told about you. And now? She looked at the dagger. She thought about the woman who had stood in front of the long mirror in her room on the morning of the wedding and strapped it to her leg with the cold, complete readiness of someone who had run out of alternatives. She thought about how much of that woman was still present in her and how much had been replaced by something more complex, less armored, built for a different kind of survival. Not weaker, more specific. Knowing what she was protecting now instead of simply knowing she needed to protect something. Now, she said, it reminds me of the day I walked into a room expecting an enemy and found instead the beginning of something I hadn't known to look for. She looked at him. That seems worth keeping visible. He looked at her for a long moment. In his face was the expression she'd finally named sometime in the second month. Not the strategic assessment or the controlled competence, but the thing underneath all of that. The thing that had been present since the night he'd sat down across from her in the library and said, "Show me what you have," and meant it without reservation. The thing that had survived 7 years of isolation and one significant betrayal and the specific damage of having learned to operate without trusting anyone, and then, against every instinct and all available evidence, finding a reason to try again. It looked like home. The specific expression of a man who had located, in a place he hadn't expected, the thing he'd stopped believing he would find. "Serafina," he said. "Yes," she said. He took her hand. Not dramatically, not with the performance of a moment, simply, directly, with the ease of two people who had stopped needing to establish the terms of their proximity and had started simply living inside it. They stood in the study in the spring evening, the dagger in its case on the desk between them, the city moving in its ordinary rhythms outside the window, the house carrying around them the particular quiet of a place that had been restored to its right function after a long time of being something other than what it was. She thought about what her father had understood, at 19 years old in a different study in a different city, looking at the key he wore around his neck, that the things worth protecting required you to be willing to pay the full price of protecting them, and that the payment was not a tragedy, but simply the cost of caring about something real. She understood it now, the way you only understand things you've paid for in full. Outside, the evening was moving toward dark. Not the dark of winter, something warmer, the kind that holds the memory of the day's light and releases it slowly, without drama, into whatever comes next. Neither of them moved to light the lamp. There was enough light left.